So hello everyone, I'm Kate Laughlin, one of the PACT project co-leaders.
And I'm Sandra Scott, the other PACT project co-leader.
Okay, thank you. So let us begin today. Let me say something about our image here. The constant, cumulative and for many unrelenting lack of power and control that living in poverty represents about fundamental life necessary things makes stress and its assiduous effects the first image shown in our work here together today. In looking at how poverty gets right under the skin, day after day, week after week, month after month, and for an increasing number of people, year after year. In choosing this image, we also acknowledge, however, the additional stress that is the backdrop to all of our lives at this time. But once again, we must remind ourselves how living without many of the resources needed to ameliorate at least some of that stress compounds it further for our young people, their families and communities. And for many, poverty has turned this crisis and continues to turn it into a traumatic experience. So we thought that was an appropriate image to begin to set our context for today. In our first module, our special virus related one, we opened by setting out a stall clearly and naming poverty as the problem, not the people who are forced to endure it. And then in our last module, which was the first of our core modules, we set out our stall by saying it's not poverty which is shameful, it is the existence of poverty which is shameful. So, having set our stall clearly for our attitude and values with impact, with today's quote, we bring them into practice. The practice of education and of human rights. Our focus today is on poverty and what it does to people and how it feels, on mental health. So let us start here with knowledge of what we have a right to expect and to demand the progressive realisation of for not only our young folk, but their families and communities. So for this module, we also set the tone right from the beginning with this quote. Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which may I remind you, came into force, is legally binding under international law, came into force in 1976, and which the UK has signed and ratified. So Article 12 says, everyone has the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. So with that in mind, let me pass you on to Sandra, who will introduce you to our specific module today.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming back to join us again, and a special welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. In our core module 2 today, actually it's the third module overall, but the first was the special topic module. We're going to be introducing the human rights sign in our slides here. You'll remember last time we introduced the delta sign for change, but this time we wanted to just to make the point that everything we do here is underpinned by a human rights approach to poverty. So I'll just give you a moment to have a quick look at our aims here for today. So we're hoping to deepen understanding of poverty and its effect, to deepen understanding of its potential educational impacts, to increase awareness of good practice and research-based evidence on teaching and learning around poverty, to provide information and resources on developing classroom activities and whole school approaches to anti-poverty work, and to deepen understanding of a human rights-based approach to poverty. So we'll just take a quick look at our session plan for today. And we're going to be alternating from school-based issues to wider society. And we felt that we want to move between the personal and the political, because as we know, public issues often cause private troubles. So I'll just give you a moment to look over the session plan for yourself there. So we start today with definitions, very important definitions. A lot of the issues that we look at today around how poverty feels and how it is under the skin focus on stigma and shame. Looking at these definitions, stigma, a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person, we discovered that actually the origin of this word comes via Latin from Greek, and it meant a mark made by a pointed instrument, and it's related to the word stick. So it's this almost branding that you carry around with yourself when you're living in poverty. Secondly, shame, a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consciousness of wrong or foolish behaviour. And we'll all recognise shame as an emotion that many of our young people are carrying around with them. And stigma and shame around poverty are actually nothing new. I'm going to take you back now to 1751, and we'll take a quick look at two prints by Hogarth. So here we have Beer Street and Gin Lane, and they were both responses to the gin craze that was happening then. If anyone here loves gin, then I hope this doesn't put you off too much thinking of its origins. So these prints were also responses to the government's inadequacy in tackling the social issues and the health issues that were caused by excessive gin drinking in poor communities. So on the left here, Beer Street shows London as it should be, according to Hogarth. And we see the happy, hard-working citizens drinking good English ale, just like their ancestors did. And we've got the blacksmith in Beer Street, who's the central figure there, contrasting with the shady underworld figures, the gin dealers, and in their gin distilling, they would often cut their products with unpleasant and harmful substances, and it was then specifically marketed at the poor. And you can see the effects of that in Gin Lane here on the right. And that also brings to mind for me the images of truckloads of champagne being delivered to the Tory party conference last year. So we can compare and contrast this with the more modern representations coming up. So some people like to call programmes like the scheme, like Benefit Street, and they like to call it poverty porn. I prefer to call it the propaganda machine of the war on the poor. And for those not familiar with these shows, I'm going to use a trailer for Benefit Street just to give you a flavour. And I want you to try and tune in to the representations here and think about the agenda of the filmmakers, because, I mean, really their business is stigma. We can see some really contrived shots. I think they're hinting at these people being like animals in a zoo, really. And I feel like if they'd filmed this differently, there would have been public outrage at the people here being left without support and stigmatised and made to feel shame. We can clearly see there are health issues here, and that all becomes distorted under the dehumanising gaze of the production company here. And there's a particularly troubling comment in the trailer about money, and I'm sure you'll pick up on that, where it really shows that the woman has either internalised poverty stigma and is trying to put a brave face on that and say something that's expected of her, or maybe she's been deliberately put up to this by the producers. So we'll take a quick look now at Benefit Street.
Unemployed. You see this street here? James Turner Street was one of the best streets. Unemployed. No, one of the worst.
James Turner Street in Birmingham is not your average street. There are 99 houses, 13 nationalities, and most of the residents are claiming benefits.
Probably 5% of people on this road that are working.
But times are getting tougher.
Housing
He's going to get caught. What kind of nonsense is that?
They're having to learn to get by on less
How are we supposed to live on £50 a week?
and rely on each other more.
If the council won't come and pick it up, we'll do it ourselves. Some guy! It's mad. It's just like one great big family. Is there any point?
Don't talk to me.
Is there any point?
Do not
Is
talk
there any point?
to me.
I don't think you could ever meet anything any more dysfunctional.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, send me down a couple of hours.
Over the course of a year, through good times and bad, life on James Turner Street
I've never lived without my kids, ever.
would be challenged like never before.
It's not all about money. You can have all the money in the world and have nothing compared to what we've got around here.
That's a crowd.
So I'm sure you'll agree that that's outrageous, really. I'm just picking up on a possible racist agenda there as well. I mean, why are they mentioning, oh, so many different nationalities in the street, you know? So you'll be glad to know that there are some organisations who are actively resisting this. And one of those is the anti-poverty organisation, ATD Fourth World. And they're one of our project partners. And they also take a human rights approach to poverty. So ATD Fourth World undertook a project called The Roles We Play. And they were really aware that there have been many stories about people living in poverty in the media. And by and large, those have been negative stories, and they really demonise people and represent the poor as the other. And then the effect then is to distance the viewer or the reader and make them seem less sympathetic to the policies needed to tackle poverty. And even supportive stories about people living in poverty can sometimes represent a form of sympathetic othering by representing them as somehow different and as passive victims lacking in agency. And when their voices are heard, the story is always framed by someone else. And so this is why The Roles We Play is such an important project. It allows people with experience of poverty to tell their own stories in the way that they want to tell them. And in doing so, people who've not experienced poverty can better understand that just like them, people in poverty exercise agency in their everyday lives, but they're doing so with much greater constraints. And every day, people living in poverty exercise agency in the struggle to get by, and in the ways they support family members, friends, neighbours, and other members of their local communities, and in their attempts to create better lives and better conditions. And in doing so, they make a huge contribution to society in really important ways, even if they don't happen to be in paid work. So, a couple of comments here from contributors to the project. B, who's a carer, says, the media often make us seem so different, so much less than others. This gives us the chance to show that we're just normal people trapped in abnormal circumstances that we did not create. Kathy, a human rights activist, says, when you live in long-term poverty, you have to depend on services that are delivered with suspicion and disdain. They make you feel humiliated. The stereotyping of all poor people dehumanises them in the eyes of others. And I'm sure you'll have seen examples of this scornful gaze from various services, at times including education. So here are 3 beautiful photographs from the project. And the way they worked made sure that it was a really authentic and critical dialogue. This is what can happen when we look at things in a different way. The participants here have a right to control how they're represented and defined. So we see this first young woman here, a loving friend, that's her role in the community. The second here, creativity, and the third, a handyman. And each of the participants here is really noticeable and visible. And the facilitators supported them when it was necessary, but the participants were fully in control. So This project really gave the participants freedom of action without control from external researchers, consultants or donors, because we know that they can quite often impose more traditional methods of inquiry and action. So I just want to leave you with a thought here that perhaps you could do something like this in your own learning community. So we're taking it into school again now, and we're going to watch a really short clip, which you may have seen this if you were at the launch. And then we're going to have a short discussion about it just in the big group here.
I had the form right and I had to go up a teacher to stamp it. And I didn't want to. Like, I genuinely did not want to go up and ask this teacher. Because it's embarrassing. You know what I mean? Like, so the fact that I had to actually go up and say, right, and I had to get my target grades to put on the sheet to fill in. So I had to go ask another teacher if I can get the, and he's like, why? And I was like, to fill in the EMA form, and it's like, do you know what I mean? Yeah. So it's more embarrassing, rather if they just sent out and then you could just fill it in. You didn't need to get a teacher to sign it, or, I mean, I get why you need a teacher, because for the school, but I don't think you should.
We were hoping that perhaps you might be interested in exploring Michael's situation a wee bit. And I have some perhaps prompts that might help to get discussion going. But before we do, I just want to highlight this as an example of where money is really, really important, and really just to pick up on the comments earlier that were talking about money not big enough. I totally understand how important it is to make the statement about being dehumanised and being othered. But I do want to say that some people in the media and so on pick up in comments that when you talk about that money is part of what goes on in that dehumanisation of people in poverty, by actually saying, well, that kind of means that money doesn't matter. We mean it all matters. The best way to lift people out of poverty is for them to have enough money. So let's be quite blunt about that. And so this is a situation that Michael's in, where he is in school, he's having to apply for EMA. He's said very clearly how embarrassed he is because he needs that, because obviously in terms of his family income, and he needs that money. So I just wondered if we wanted to explore it a wee bit in terms of, should that situation have been avoided? And do you think there's ever a trade-off in these kind of situations if you're trying to avoid it? And maybe just thinking about, in terms of thinking about those trade-offs, if you do think there is one, what is the role of attitudes and values in assessing these trade-offs? And how could that situation have been avoided? These are just some prompts. Happy to hear any thoughts you have about the film. So please do either sort of use the chat function to raise your hand, or physically raise your hand if you're on camera. Hello, Keith. Was that you raising your hand?
Yeah. Sorry. I don't work in a school now. I used to work in school up till March, but I work at the university. But when I did work in the school, what we did with the EMA was we didn't have pupils in that situation. We knew who was entitled to the EMA, and what we would do is we would do it through registration. We would see if they were attending through registration. So they have to have to have a certain amount of attendance to qualify. So we would never approach the pupil. We would get that from registration. If we did need to speak to the pupil about anything to do with the EMA, we'd always talk to them on their own in confidence, rather than, so it was never a case of, it's like the free school meals. It was the same thing. Their card would be loaded automatically by the office, and they would go, and no one knew the wiser whether they had free school meals or not. Their card was loaded with money, so when they went to pay for it, they were no different from anyone else. So we went out the way to make sure that nobody knew where someone was getting an EMA or somebody was getting the free school meals. So I think that was important for us.
No, absolutely. And in a way, you've thank you for that. You've kind of preempted one of my next prompts, which was what kind of process could be in place that would avoid similar situations in future. So thank you. You've obviously described something that I thought has to get into in such a process.
Yeah, I think as well, I'm doing some tomorrow at the uni, because I teach in a lot of the teacher training modules. It's on the cost of the school day, and the cost of the school day is what I'm interested in, and it's amazing how when you see the cost of the school day and the things that the schools can do to reduce that cost, and some of the initiatives that we've put in place, both in the school, you know, is great what we can do. And you're right, money has got an influencing factor, but for us in schools, it used to be that some kids would actually select the subject because of the cost. So they wouldn't take home ecce because of the cost. They wouldn't go on a school trip because of the cost. But in the school I worked in, they all got a free breakfast, and they now no longer pay for home ecce, don't pay for technical, they don't pay for all that, so that they're not disadvantaged because of their ability to pay. So I think that's important as well. Sorry for going on a bit, but it's just quite important, I think.
No, not at all. You haven't gone on, and absolutely. Am I right in thinking you're joining us for the first time tonight, Keith?
Yeah, sorry,
Yes,
yeah, that's the first time.
No, that's great, and welcome. We work closely with CPAG and the other councils and organisations that are working on cost of the school day work, and in fact CPAG are represented on a project advisory board, so we work in tandem with that. But one of the focuses of our project is also looking at attitudes and beliefs.
Yes,
and so on, because teachers have told us that they also want to understand more about poverty and to deepen their understanding about poverty, and to get peer support and actually looking at cultural change. So we're aiming for cultural change, which is why we do go into the details of the cost of the school day, but we're very interested in citing that within that wider picture.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say as well, what I found is I'm doing a PhD at the uni as well, and what I'm looking at is parental engagement as well. So the parental engagement, what we did was we got the parents involved with learning what the kids were doing, because they had this stigma about, oh, I'm poor, I won't be listened to, and it's amazing how much difference it made, parents being involved in the school, all school activities, and then so that helped with the children as well to raise attainment. So that's what we're looking at as well, is the effects of poverty on attainment, but also how that parental engagement helps as well to reduce that gap. So there's a lot going on, and I think what you're doing is good. You know, I think it's really terrific.
Excellent, and we want to reach out and make contact, so it's really good to hear what you're doing, and let's follow up that discussion, because we're actually touching upon initial teacher education tonight as well. We think that's very important. And parental engagement, as those of you who've been here before will know, is a big plank of what we're doing. Parental and community involvement, because our young people don't live in isolation in schools, they live their lives in families and communities, and we obviously need to cite the school within that. So thank you very much for that.
It was just to say, even if the people, there's an element of anonymity about the people signing up to these things, they still have to be different from their peers and do an additional task in their day. Even in our local authority, I filled out the forms, got the target grades, done things like that. They still have to sign their life away, committing to attending for so many hours and getting their target grades and jumping through this. I think it's an additional stigmatising process. The trade-off is, yes, it's a life skill to fill out forms and sign them and all the rest of it, but other people don't have to do it. They get the hurdles swept out their way.
Thank you. That's really good points. Thanks very much, Carol. As you know, we are coming from a default position of that there shouldn't be additional costs to the school day, but equally there shouldn't be additional barriers, of course. So thank you very much for that. So from Erin, says, I received EMA when at high school. My attendance percentage was also calculated centrally, and I don't remember having a card ticked by teachers. So that's sort of backing up basically what Keith was saying earlier. And then from Alina, decades ago I wanted to get a part-time job while at school, and had to get a form signed to say it wouldn't affect my academic attainment, which is similar, although I wasn't in poverty, but it would have been the same for everyone. Thanks for that, Elena. It's really good to hear other experiences here. And Kevin has given us a comment here saying, in college I was caring for an elderly relative and my attendance was all over the place. Having to get my attendance checked for EMA was an awful experience. I'm sorry to hear that, and that I think what we're hearing is it might still be an awful experience for too many of our people. Yeah, thanks, Kev. And from Erin again, the idea that cultural change is necessary is absolutely true. Schools compound the stigma for the sake of bureaucracy. And Alina agrees, saying it defeats the whole purpose.
So here's our word cloud so far.
Oh, yes.
We're going to upload these to the resources that will come after the session, just so we can reflect on our discussions. Michael had his EMA form, his Educational Maintenance Allowance, and he had to go around, you know, getting signatures from teachers. Was he reaching his target grades? Was his attendance good enough, and so on? And we just saw, you know, how that made him feel, you know, the effect of stigma and shame there. So we're just going to stay all together rather than going to a breakout room just now. Feel free to comment either on camera if you're feeling nice and brave, or you can comment in the chat. And we want to think about maybe, you know, how could this situation have been avoided? Should it have been avoided? And is there ever a sort of trade-off that we have to make in this situation? And maybe some of you have some ideas about what process could be in place that would avoid similar situations in the future, and what needs to happen for that to come about. And, you know, maybe you've had similar situations in your school and you think there could be a role for groups of people in your school, for example, pupil council or parents. So ideas are welcome. Just pop your hand up in the participant list, or you can give us a comment in the chat if you prefer. We're never going to pick on people and do that horrible teacher thing. So it's entirely voluntary, but we do really want to get your comments. So a comment from Lisa here, an electronic register that triggers an absence to be discussed with a form tutor would be better, because then you can have that discussion privately, maybe see what that student's dealing with at home. I think that's a really good idea. I think somebody's unmuting. Oh, comment from Liz, first of all. Yeah, could it be managed through the school office again? Yeah, you would hope so. But again, you know, in some schools, maybe in smaller schools, there are issues with that as well. If the office know too much about you, you know, too much about the student, it might feel a bit stigmatizing. Yeah, so Judith is saying that it could be the default that everyone fills out the form and then you can choose whether or not to apply. So I think Nikat wants to come in with a comment here. I can see your wee hand there.
As usual. So I think my comment is along the line of Judith, that if the schools know their families and they know the families well enough, then this kind of following up or filling forms constantly might not be needed. I don't know how high schools work, so I'm coming from a primary perspective, but it just seems a bit like unnecessary stress and work, which is making additional work for everybody, to me, it seems like. So why are we doing it?
Yeah. I mean, I know that some local authorities have been looking to move over to automation for the EMA, because if we look at, I don't know if we've got any Glasgow people here. Glasgow have already automated the school clothing grant, and that's just paid directly into the bank account, you know, for people who have this entitlement. But of course there are problems with families, you know, maybe not having bank accounts. But yeah, it's taking away this additional barrier, you know. It's just that feeling of having to go around and say, oh, can I have some money please, sir, you know. Yeah, Claire's saying here about it's better to be completed with a guidance teacher who'll know personal circumstances. I think that's very important as well. Kate, would you like to come in on that one?
Thank you, Sandra. I just wanted to sort of share a comment that was from one of our participants when we did this session on Wednesday. As you know, we run them on Wednesday and Friday. Excuse me. And the comment was really, it's a bit like, why should young people have to sign their life away? And a comment on the onerous attendance requirements around EMA, which is also something that young people who are not in receipt of EMA don't have to comply with in the same way anyway. So I think that was a good point. I just wanted to repeat it.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for all your comments there. as you know, if you've been to any of our things before, we always want to emphasize that the personal is very much political. So let's keep that in mind now as we move on to the overarching political picture. So I'll just reshare for us and Kate will continue.
Continuing our theme of looking under the skin of things, we want to help you to kind of triangulate your perspectives in poverty. Today, thinking about deepening our understanding how poverty feels and what it does to mental health, we want to look at the politics of poverty and mental health and introduce some perspectives from social sciences, in particular for today, from psychology. We want to bother some tools and perspectives. Most of you will be familiar with at least some of them, but just initially to touch upon a few before we move on to look at a couple in a bit more depth. We want to perhaps encourage you to think again about something we've raised before about the idea of othering. And just to give you a sort of quote on that, just to sort of contextualise that again, this is from a 2015 study from Ciuffatelli and Parker, who say that the bottom line is that it is vital to the well-being and learning success of children that they are not viewed as othered by teachers. Ultimately, educators need to work towards resisting deficit-based conceptualisations of students and their families and avoid derogatory stereotyping of what it means to live in poverty. We touch upon othering as a continual theme throughout this, and also a couple of other things that may be useful thinking about. We have looked at a concept from sociology about looking at Bernstein's restricted and elaborated code, and I'm just flagging that up to say that that will be in the resource pack. And also another one that I'm flagging up, which we'll deal with in the next module from sociology, which Sandra mentioned, is the idea of private troubles and public issues, the work of C. Wright Mills in particular. So returning back to psychology, of course, another major theme that's reflected in our work is deservedly, we think, around the importance of narrative. And there's a huge body of work there in psychology, but also in political science and social sciences, and of course in education itself, with an increasing recognition of importance in the field there, for example, in nurture settings. So let's look more at that then in terms of looking at perspectives from psychology and naming the issue of the politics of poverty and mental health. First, let's look at a position statement from a group called Psychologists Against Poverty, of which I'm proud to be a member. They say austerity policies have damaging psychological costs. Mental health problems are being created in the present, and further problems are being stored for the future. They say we have identified 5 austerity ailments, and these are specific ways in which austerity policies impact on mental health. So we have the first on the screen here, humiliation and shame. Let's look at the rest. Fear and distrust, instability and insecurity, isolation and loneliness, and being trapped and powerless. This briefing paper was prepared before the current crisis. All of these will be familiar to you. They're obviously not just about adults, but obviously reflect the experiences of too many of our children and young people, and obviously this is intensified more in the current crisis. So let's contrast that with some important indicators of a psychologically healthy society from this group. So, agency, security, connection, meaning, and trust. And these themes are themes that, again, are continually reflected in all our work, and I'm going to particularly return to the idea of agency and meaning shortly. They go on to say, mental health isn't just an individual issue. To create resilience and promote well-being, we need to look at the entirety of the social and economic conditions in which people live. And of course, again, this refers to all people, including our young folk. Ignoring for the moment the words austerity and resilience, because they both have a lot of baggage, and we don't have time really to get into that today, it is important to say that in terms of mental health and poverty, psychology is wakening up to the need to move away from solely individual positioning and to cite mental health issues, mental distress within its societal context more and more. As an example of that, as well as the existence of this group here, the British Psychological Society's current national campaign is entitled From Poverty to Flourishing. I'm pleased to be able to contribute to that in a personal capacity by being on their expert reference group for the campaign. PACT is committed to respond to the education profession's demand to offer paths to a deeper understanding of poverty. And one of the ways we think we can do that, as we said, is to look at these different ways and support you to have different ways of looking at it, different tools for understanding its different manifestations better. So let's touch upon a few more, what we think are useful ideas from psychology for understanding better how poverty seems and feels and what it does, including introducing a relatively new framework that excites us as a potential to understanding. But first of all, a concept that many of you will be familiar with, the idea of cognitive dissonance. For those of you who may not be, the idea around this is that the mind really wants to it tries to resolve the stress around holding two contradictory ideas about the same thing at the same time. And because that is so stressful for us to do, we try to resolve it either by ignoring one of the ideas, by denying it, or by incorporating one of the ideas into the other one becoming the dominant idea, by suppressing it, but by overwhelmingly doing what we can to resolve what is an intolerable stress for us, and which often results in a feeling of stuckness or paralysis and doesn't allow us to move on. So we would like to consider the idea together today that young people who experience poverty could potentially be in a situation of cognitive dissonance when it comes to their education and their school and experience. We ask, is there a possible conflict between our educational narratives and the reality otherwise experienced in the lives of young people enduring poverty, which could possibly produce that kind of stuckness between conflicting realities and narratives that could paralyse and force learners to almost make an impossible choice? Which narrative or reality do we respond to? Home or school? Negative media portrayals of working class or poor families, as we looked at earlier, or an educational narrative of aspiration and agency, powerful or powerless? We're just touching upon this for the moment, but we'll look at more of that in the next module. So looking at widening that out and thinking about the idea of narrative psychology, which is a field in itself, there is a great deal of importance attached to the impact of narrative on the individual. Let's look at these. And in particular, in developing and maintaining a sense of actually who ourselves is, who we are. And in constructing a personal and shared sense of identity. And in imagining the possible, that things could be different. And that's one of the things that actually narrative helps us to do, and particularly so when we're thinking about our life narrative. Let me give you a couple of quick quotes there. McAdams, a psychologist who's done a lot of work in this, says, some researchers argue that narrative is the vehicle for bringing together for ourselves the present, the past, and the future into a coherent whole. In terms of that is the way that researchers in this field argue, and mine's work. And Brunner, who's been very influential in that field and is influential in my own perspectives, actually goes further and says, I argue that a life as led is inseparable from a life as told. Or more bluntly, a life is not how it was, but how it is interpreted and reinterpreted, told and retold. In other words, he argues that actually our life narrative becomes our very self. How we see ourselves is reflected, and how we talk about our life narrative, and how other people crucially reflect that back to us. So let's specifically move on to actually look at holding these thoughts, a particular framework within psychology that we think is relevant to these and really interesting. So it's called the Power, Threat, Meaning Framework. And it's a framework that we think may have something to offer our work. So we're tentatively presenting it to you here, as perhaps it may be useful to you. Obviously, that's for you to decide. So we're just introducing it. It was published in 2018 by the British Psychological Society's Division of Clinical Psychology, having been developed over 5 years in response to widespread criticisms within the psychological profession of the current diagnostic and conceptual frameworks around mental distress. However, the authors offer it for wider use, not only in clinical settings. It's already been welcomed by, for example, social work and nursing professionals. And as we're saying, we think perhaps education professionals might be interested in perhaps adding this to the concepts that you have for understanding these issues. So like the ACEs model, it is a trauma-informed approach. However, it potentially builds on the ACEs model. And many here will know there has been some criticism of the ACEs model, although useful, for being too individualistic and actually ignoring the wider cultural and political context that within things happen. So this is complementary to the ACEs models. Of course, not a substitute for it, but we actually think that it could be useful because it allows for a wider explanation, which, like the other model, is also free of stigma and blame, but it accommodates not only individual experiences and behaviours, but also accommodates families and communities in terms of in the framework. So before I say a wee bit more about what it is briefly, let me say what it's not. So it's not presented as accepted guidelines or standards within that profession yet. But as I said, although very well received, it has also been contested in terms of psychology and psychiatry, and challenging as it does the dominant model. However, that's not our purpose, and really we don't need to get into that here. What is interesting, we think, is that the basic underlying premises are incontestable across fields. Humans are meaning-making creatures who develop many widely recognisable behavioural and thought patterns in response to actual or perceived threat. We know this, of which shame and stigma are examples. So we think this is actually very useful in relation to that. So let us see what it actually is. So in summary, this framework for the origins and maintenance of distress replaces the question, what is wrong with you, with 4 others. So yes, what has happened to you, but meaning how has power operated in your life? How did it affect you? Meaning what kind of threats does this pose? What sense did you make of it? What are the meaning of these situations and experiences to you? And what did you have to do to survive? What kinds of threat response are you using? So we think this could present you, perhaps, as teachers and other education professionals, with a different way of looking at situations and learners' responses to them.
Hi, I'm Dr. Ray Middleton, and this is a very brief introduction to the Power Threat Meaning Framework. A number of different social and social psychological models and frameworks have been developed to help us understand people. Models and frameworks are a kind of lens for looking through to help our understanding when we're trying to help people. For example, the medical model tends to see people through the lens of health and illness, and would encourage someone to look for illness by looking for symptoms, and those symptoms could support giving a diagnosis of a disorder, and typically some treatment would be prescribed for the disorder. So that's the medical model. An alternative to the medical model is the biopsychosocial model, which would encourage someone to look for the physical and biological factors, the psychological factors, and the social factors that contribute to someone's mental and emotional difficulties. Another new framework, published in 2018 by the British Psychological Society, is the Power Threat Meaning Framework. This framework specifically considers the role power and trauma plays in understanding people's difficulties and their personal stories. Remember, models and frameworks are attempts to simplify complex information about people in order to help us all make sense of it. They can help the information someone shares not to feel overwhelming to them or to the listener, as we can locate each piece of information shared within a wider picture of a framework. So frameworks can help to contain and explain what we are hearing. The Power Threat Meaning Framework is a new way to understand why people sometimes experience a range of distress, confusion, fear, despair, and troubled or troubling behaviour. It's an alternative to the medical model, which is based on psychiatric diagnosis. The framework can be used to understand any human being, not just people accessing mental health services. The framework considers the role different kinds of power have in people's lives, the types of threat posed by misuse of power, and the ways people learn to respond to threat. Traditional mental health practices sometimes call these threat responses symptoms. The framework looks at how we make sense of difficult experiences and how messages from the media and wider society can increase our feelings of shame, self-blame, isolation, fear or guilt.
And we think that, as well as giving you a different way of looking at situations, more importantly, it could perhaps give a wider range of potential tools for making sense of those responses, of a different narrative that actually has the potential to affect change and so has hopes attached to it. We also think that it has the potential to equip young people with the means of identifying the operation of power and threat in their lives, with an ability to develop not just an emotional toolkit around it, but what Brunner calls a cultural toolkit. There are now a range of useful resources on the BPS site on this, and we'll obviously give you some links to that in the resource pack that you get. But for now, we simply present this as what seems to us, at least, to be an intuitively sound way of thinking about some situations. Whether you agree is for you to decide, and we'd love your thoughts and any feedback you would want to give us in this. So thank you. Let's step back specifically to our education perspective again, to see some more from our young folk and their experiences in school around the embarrassment, stigma and shame that poverty creates. So over to you, Sandra.
Thank you, Kate. So I'm going to show you a short clip just now, bringing together some of the research from various schools around Scotland that was conducted by the Child Poverty Action Group. So I'll just play that for you now. So these issues and these feelings aren't unique to Scotland, and we've been really keen in the project to look internationally to see some examples of good practice that are happening elsewhere. So we just want to give you a quick snapshot of some work that's been happening in Ontario, Canada. So in Ontario, the school communities became very aware that although Canada is a very rich nation, still 1 in 5 children live in poverty. And similarly to here, this rate more than doubles for children in female-headed single-parent households and for children of First Nations.
So this is a poem that was originally written in the US. Some of you will be familiar with it. I'll just read it out just in case there are some of you who need that. So I woke myself up because we ain't got an alarm clock. Dug in the dirty clothes basket because ain't nobody washed my uniform. Brushed my hair and teeth in the dark because the lights ain't on. Even got my baby sister ready because my mama wasn't home. Got us both to school in time to eat us a good breakfast. Then when I got to class, the teacher fussed because I ain't got a pencil. So one of the things that we wanted to think about in relation to what we've just looked at in the power threat meaning framework, what kind of power situation are we in here? What kind of threat does the teacher fussing, in the words of this poem, mean to this young person because they haven't got a pencil? And crucially, what do you think that young person is likely to do then? Does anyone want to suggest some responses there? Perhaps you might like to put that in the chat. I can see that Michael's saying it's hard not to fuss about a pencil, I must admit. Okay, thanks, Michael, that's very honest. Anyone else want to contribute? Okay, so I suppose we're offering this here as perhaps thinking about that in relation, this framework that we presented a moment ago useful in understanding this young person's situation and how they may act as they do? Is it even helpful in discussing the teacher's situation, who is very upset about them not having a pencil? What does that represent for the teacher? So one of the things that we wanted to have an activity around was actually talking about that and sort of teasing that out. So we'll give you a wee bit more information out of that in one of the resources. So let's just have a look at a couple more of the chat before we move on. Know your pupils would let you understand the pupil's circumstances. From Keith, the pupil might show distressed behaviour as she or he feels the situation is unjust. That's from Erin. From Carol, a sense of failure despite overcoming all the barriers and achievements to learning and well-being. Failure has a note of finality. From Kevin, immediately shut out the only avenue of escape for a child from a chaotic background. School could be that person's saving grace in their life, the one constant source of support. The threats, shamed and embarrassed in front of the class, from Heather. And from Stephanie, it's very helpful to consider what's happened for a child before they get to school and the challenges they have already faced. And from Joshua, disengagement, people already had a stressful morning and confronted before they even start. From Erin, the issue is there are no pencils. Often resources are bought, teachers do understand, but the system doesn't. That's an interesting point. It's picking up on the point, what kind of threat, in a sense, is that for the teacher when a young person in that situation asks for a pencil and there are none. From Heather, meaning to people a waste of time doing it all may feel unwanted at school as well as at home perhaps. And from Victoria, the stress that this child has suffered before school is immense. How can we expect the learning brain to be ready when they get to school? Thank you everyone for those comments. Please feel free to add more. It's something that, as I hope you would agree, could actually want a bit more discussion, and please do feel free to take that away and use it for yourself. So let's look again at some other ways of looking at the situation that many of our young people may find themselves in, and their families and their communities in relation to education and to teachers and so on. So this is from sociology, and we're just looking briefly again at the idea of habitus and symbolic capital, and particularly cultural capital. So this might be familiar to some of you, it certainly will be familiar to those from a social science discipline, but it won't be to many others. It's an example of another foundational and widespread theoretical and pragmatic position from another discipline that we think might be a useful way of thinking about poverty and its impact in young people's lives. Let me just give you the Oxford Dictionary of Sociology definition on this for those who are not familiar with it. A term introduced by Pierre Bourdieu to refer to the symbols, ideas and tastes and preferences that can be strategically used as resources in social action. He sees this cultural capital as a habitus, an embodied, socialised tendency or disposition to act, think or feel in a particular way. By analogy with economic capital, such resources can be invested and accumulated and can be converted into other forms. Thus, middle-class parents are able to endow their children with the linguistic and cultural competencies that will give them a greater likelihood of success at school and in university. Working class children without access to such cultural resources are less likely to be successful in the educational system. Thus, education reproduces class inequalities. Bourdieu sees the distribution of economic and cultural capital as reinforcing each other. Educational success, reflecting initial cultural capital, is the means through which superior, higher paying occupations can be attained. And the income earned through these jobs may allow the successful to purchase a private education for their children and so enhance their chances of educational success. This conversion of one form of capital into another is central to the intra-generational or intergenerational reproduction of class differences. Bourdieu recognises a number of other forms of capital most notably the social capital of contacts and connections. We think these ideas of habitus and cultural capital are useful for those who haven't come across it before as another way of rounding out our understanding of poverty. So let's look a wee bit more briefly at habitus. So this is kind of a busy slide. I just screenshotted this from a little film explaining a wee bit more about habitus and cultural capital, which you'll get a link to in the resources. So habitus, just to say a wee bit more, is a way of being in the world. It can be hinted at through even such things as way of walking, of speech, of body language, of nuances of dress, of recognising people like us. Somebody said to me once when I was invited round for tea to one of my daughter's classmates in a very wealthy house quite near where I lived, she started talking about PLU, and I showed that I wasn't PLU by having to ask her what PLU meant, but apparently it meant people like us. So these things can be conveyed in many, many ways, and I must have been masking my true working class origins for the purposes of that, I think. So how you guys see the world and how the world will see you is an interesting idea around habitus. And perhaps through the other's habitus, the teacher's habitus, how does the working class child or the child who's living in poverty view? Because obviously it's not a total mapping on, but we do think class is important to bring in here as a factor. So there's too much to discuss here, all that's on the screen, but let's look at some practical examples. Let's look at some quotes here. So this is taken from PACT's Cost of the School Day work in Glasgow. Depends who you hang about with whether you get slagged. The popular crowd wouldn't accept you in supermarket clothes. And another. So basically, if your parents can buy them books, then you're at an advantage already. We give all the practical advice that we can, but the honest black and white truth is that kids from high-income families are better set up to succeed. And we can't overcome all those barriers because we don't have the money. And that was a staff member from their 2015 report. So do you think that's true or not? Is it about the books themselves or what the books represent, or both? Georges in 2004 defined a form of symbolic capital he defined institutionalised cultural capital, which is a form of symbolic capital, as, quote, a result of educational achievements in educational institutions with the power to define what is important and unimportant knowledge, and objective cultural capital as artefacts such as books or art, etc. Here's a wee visual example next. So I won't dwell on this, but just looking at clothes, thinking about school, thinking about the idea of uniforms, looking at accessories, looking at even body language, eye contact, filling the space, all the things in these examples that communicate cultural capital, perhaps economic capital, and certainly different kinds of habitus. So let's look at, for now, the last of our delve into perspectives from the social sciences and the idea of cognitive dissonance. I think we perhaps touched upon that earlier. We certainly have touched upon it before. And you'll probably be familiar with that concept, but for those who aren't, it's the stress that is created when we try to hold two conflicting ideas in our mind at the one time. And the mind really doesn't like the stress, so it tries to find a way to resolve it. And sometimes it resolves it by denying one of the factors, sometimes it resolves it by absorbing one of the factors into the other belief, and sometimes it resolves it in many ways, all of which can actually cause stress. But the issue is that we feel that we have to resolve it. It's a very uncomfortable place for us to be mentally. So we are positing that young people who experience poverty are in a possible situation of cognitive dissonance within school and with the messages that school give. Let's use some earlier images to think a wee bit more about that and reflect back on those. We are suggesting that perhaps the conflict between our educational narratives and the reality of young people's lives otherwise could potentially produce the kind of paralysis in a way that cognitive dissonance produces until it is able to be resolved between those conflicting realities and narratives that could in theory paralyse and force learners to make an almost impossible choice. Which narrative or reality to respond to? Home or school? negative media portrayals of working class or poor families, or an educational narrative of aspiration and agency? Powerful or powerless? We'll elaborate more on that later in the programme, but for a moment, let's think for a moment on this example. Let's have the next slide, please, Sandra. So we spotted this in a bin on the path to a school in Glasgow, and it was to be one of our activities again in our longer learning session, and we will give you the details for this if you actually want to take that up. This is a message that's on the bin. When your education is actually induction into a destructive way of living, active truancy is a revolutionary act. Truants of the world unite. So we were thinking about that in relation to cognitive dissonance. We were thinking of it in relation to habitus as a young person in school. We were thinking about it in relation to the different types of cultural capital that different young people may have in school. And we were thinking about doing a case study where we have two different young people, one from a well-off and privileged background, one from a low-income background, who both take part in this and do it together, and about perhaps potentially the different responses that may happen either from school, we're not making assumptions, we're saying potentially, or potentially from home, and what happens for the knock-on effects of those. So we'll give you some details of that activity we were thinking about in our pack. So just quickly moving on, because I'm aware that we've got a lot to cover here, and this is eating into time perhaps a bit, so I'll try and go through these. So basically we wanted to talk about a wee bit in relation to this, in relation to human rights education. As you know, this is one of the big themes in our programme, and we just wanted to talk to you a wee bit about all of these things are very relevant to human rights education, because we're trying to create a cognitively harmonious narrative rather than a cognitively dissonant narrative. I just wanted to briefly highlight 3 Scottish papers as details in the resource pack. This one that's here, Building Blocks for Improving Human Rights Education within Initial Teacher Education in Scotland, from Alison Struthers. Some of our participants here tonight may be familiar with that. And that made a couple of recommendations. The first is the inclusion of HRE within ITE should be made compulsory, and this change should be reflected by amendment to GTCS standards. Competence in HRE should be included as an express requirement of provisional registration with the GTCS and would fit naturally within the social justice element of learning for sustainabilities. And the second recommendation was, given the current structure of ITE programmes within Scottish universities, the inclusion of HRE should be facilitated through the development of a flexible and non-prescriptive web-based resource that is made available to Scottish ITE providers. And I'll draw your attention to another couple of documents, a review of human rights education in schools in Scotland that Elaine Watts wrote for Venus in 2013, and a more recent one from Stephen Daniels, who's a former teacher, HRE in Scotland, Challenges and Opportunities. I'll just give you one quick quote there from that last one. It says, with all of this in mind, what's striking about the research literature is that there appears to be a broad consensus among teachers in Scotland about the importance of teaching children about human rights. The image here on the right is really just to convey to you in an abstract way that there is a great deal being written about human rights education, including a great deal of global international studies from Finland, from the US, from Australia, India, and so on. Many of them talking about the empowering and transformational nature of human rights education. Again, we'll give you some sort of context to that in the resources.
New immigrant families, you know, there is this racialised risk of poverty as well. And despite many public statements over the last few decades, the child poverty rate didn't really improve. And so in Ontario, they decided we have to act on this by building a school culture that can fight poverty. So here are three really seemingly simple, but obviously more complex principles that they introduced in Ontario schools. And so the first is to talk about the kids you love. And so this is a way of resisting deficit models and deficit language. And they tried to break the typical patterns of negative discussions about students by hosting weekly staff breakfasts where teachers can talk about the kids they love and the challenges they face. And they were trying to develop a much more positive, bias-free school climate and culture. And they found that when the educators began to resist stereotyping, then their attitudes and interactions became much more positive, and they moved away from the simple observations and simple answers to much more complex understanding. Secondly, they decided that they had to engage families outside and inside the walls of the school. So they were hoping to get away from the sort of deficit approach where they were telling parents what to do to help their children how to read. And so instead of that, they wanted something much more inclusive. So they did things like hosting literacy nights, which celebrated the children's accomplishments, and they brought teachers and parents in conversation together with celebration nights, themed nights, and celebrated the adults' literacy experience in other cultures and languages. Thirdly, they saw that it was essential to forge community partnerships. And they were really looking for collective responsibility with the teachers and the educators in school, combined with the broader community, to make these connections to help the students feel supported to be successful. And so they did things like giving funding for nutrition programs, after school programs, using available resources in the community. And they set up a school community team focused solely on making these connections. Some of you might be aware of culturally responsive pedagogy already, because we know there's a really strong background here in terms of what we might call cultural proficiency if we're looking at other forms of discriminatory practice that might happen in education. So they were looking to build sociocultural consciousness among educators and to avoid this othering that can often happen. High expectations and the desire to make a difference. And that was really encouraging teachers to see themselves as agents of change, to work towards more equity. And they took a constructivist approach, understanding that actually the parents are the first educators that any child has, and the child will, of course, construct their own knowledge based on their own prior experiences. And they wanted a deep knowledge of their students, so teachers would learn about their lives and translate that into how they would learn best. And this continued emphasis on culturally responsive teaching practices helped them to really stretch students in their thinking and learning and recognise people's achievements outside school. And we'll look at a local Scottish example of that in a while. So the third strand here was facilitating activist education. And so we might ask ourselves, why do schools need activism? Well, we know that in the past decade or so, activist movements have got a lot of global media attention, and citizen collectives in Canada had already come together to take action on racism, income inequality, First Nations rights, climate change, and that had been really successful. So why not poverty? So these groups out there in society were posing these very important questions, and Ontario wanted their school students to take on an activist disposition. And so they looked outside the school really to see how the community could be involved in this. And in Ontario, they knew that there was a lot of appetite for community action on environmental issues. And so that was their way in really to build community action on poverty. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the Raging Grannies. If you haven't, please look them up because they are amazing. So just a quick example here from the primary curriculum. In Ontario, they connected with the local chapter of the Raging Grannies to do environmental projects near each school, and they had small groups of children working with a volunteer granny to clean up local parks, to sort recyclables, to plant organic gardens, and they would then bring this learning into the curriculum and explore that in numeracy lessons. So please do have a look for the Raging Grannies. So we are now going to take a quick breakout room for just around 5 minutes. And it's a really, really simple reflection task today. But as you know, we say things are simple and the most complex and deep issues come up, which we love. So when Lee sends you to a breakout room, we just want you to reflect in your groups on your own key learning point for the first half. So we'll see you back here in 5 minutes and we'll discuss your thoughts.
Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you did get a chance, albeit a short period, to think about your learning points from this session. Would anyone like to share anything with us? Hello, Nika.
I think our group talked about intersectionality and how so many of the points that we are learning about and talking about are so relevant, and if we can just have that at the back of our mind as well, it's so much easier to connect the dots, and it's not something that you address in isolation, but something that needs to be put into the bigger pot. And you know, so you focus on that, but you still link it with other things. So that's what our group kind of thought about.
Okay, thank you. That's a very important point. Thanks, Nika. Anyone else? Hello.
Hi, I was quite excited about all of the psychology things because I'm an educational psychologist, but I did a brief project with the school where we looked at people's voice of children that were experiencing poverty and their experiences and what school was like and what helped and didn't help. And it was good for me for thinking about how do I take that learning and apply it in a way that's useful a bit more and in a deeper way in the work that I do. So I guess that was my learning point from that, is it needs more thought from me, and it's something that we really could take forward and do something useful with.
Oh, that's really good to hear. Thank you so much for that. Any other contributions? Do we have any other hands up? Oh, hello. Hello, Judith.
I was just thinking about, I've been beginning to work with a primary 6 class on equalities in pupil, what do they call it now? They've changed the bloody name, so it's not called pupil voice. Anyway, that's what's happening. And it was encouraging me to draw the poverty lines out more strongly with them, especially in terms of what meaning they make from it.
Well, that's really good. The
model that you gave me just there was really helpful. Thank you.
Well, that's really good to hear. I think that meaning and trying to really get that deep understanding that only comes, you know, when you really grasp the meaning of something is part of what we're trying to achieve. So thank you very much for that comment. That's really good to know. It's useful. So we have another message in the chat. Let's have a wee look. Nikat's mentioning about pupil equality groups. So that's presumably the new wording, is it?
Yes, I think that's the new wording. That's what Judith was saying. This thing. Yes.
That's helpful. Thank you, Nika. Learner participation as well. I noticed that Judith is referring to too. So, any other comments from your group? If you feel you don't want to comment at the moment, then obviously we're very happy to hear from you later if you want at any point, and you have the time, of course, in this very stressful time, to actually even just jot down some of your points. We're always delighted to hear them, and we are particularly going to be introducing a kind of longer sharing spot in the next module. So anything that you want to give us could obviously contribute to that. So thank you very much. So we're actually doing pretty good time here. Let's just see if before we go into the break, if anybody else wants to make a comment. Oh, Sandra has been doing a word cloud. Sandra.
We'll make these available to you with the resource pack when it goes out, just to remind us of some of our thoughts from these sessions. Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully we're all refreshed. We're going to start off the second half with a beautiful short clip, just about 3 minutes or so, from the Council of Europe, who are looking in this clip at the at a school factory, and I'm sure, you know, it might strike a chord with some of you and your experiences of certain types of schools. So with that nice reminder of what's possible, let's take a wee moment to reflect on something that we're all really familiar with, the 4 capacities. So we talked last time about how research and the evidence of our own eyes shows that the well-being indicators and the 4 areas of the curriculum are all undermined by poverty. And these extrinsic factors could be measured in many ways, but you know, we'll hopefully step away from the high stakes summative assessment. So looking at these 4 capacities, the intrinsic factors, the motivations, the attributes, the capabilities, we wonder if we're making assumptions here when it comes to learners growing up in poverty. If we accept that the curriculum is built on middle-class assumptions and uses middle-class maps to reach middle-class destinations, then maybe we need to remind ourselves that actually the purpose of education is not to make everyone middle class. I mean, just take a look at today's political class. You know, we need to use the curriculum to support a new generation of working class leaders. So let's take a closer look at the 4 capacities. So firstly, successful learners, but we're trying to create these successful learners, but in whose image? We're telling students that their class background is no barrier to what they can achieve, but sometimes when we look out at the world, that can feel like empty words. If we expect students to learn in an alien culture where they're treated as outsiders and subjected to the scornful gaze, then of course they'll lose their motivation and their determination to achieve. And I feel that the curriculum can become detached from the home culture, and then we end up just feeding them scraps. So we want to find a a way to guard against looking at students and thinking, how can I get them to be like me? And we need to move away from social mobility to social growth. So at a conference in Manchester in 2019, I met two young women called Nia and Olivia, who were part of the Disruptive Leaders campaign set up by the charity Reclaim. Olivia explained that Reclaim was a school outside school for her, and it had empowered working class young people to speak out in a society that silences them. So their project wants to challenge the negative perceptions of working class young people and to highlight their potential as great leaders. They want to increase awareness of the negative working class representation across all of the political system and in the media, and to highlight that negative effect that leadership inequality has on the wider society. So Nia had various issues in school, and she told me at that conference, my behaviour is a form of communication when words won't suffice. Olivia told me that a challenging upbringing should be seen as a strength and not a weakness. On that note, effective contributors. We need to break away from the institutionalised thinking in schools and think of communities. The children in our communities are gifts to society, and they're already contributing a lot to the societies of our future. For example, the COVID-19 community solidarity work in one community near me couldn't have happened without the young people who gave their time, their ingenuity, their strength, and their love. Looking at school systems not too far away from Scotland, we see warning signs. Neoliberal approaches are breaking the links with communities. They start behaving institutionally and they lose those important links. The system there is holding teachers back from supporting students as we would want to. We really want to break away from what Haberman called the pedagogy of poverty. We want to build a pedagogy of power. And power comes from language, from love, from care, and from active empowerment. And learners need the opportunity to practice feeling powerful. We need to give the space for political change. For example, Reclaim campaigned and changed Greater Manchester's transport policy. What could we do here? People are being raised with a sense of shame about where they come from. So we need to look at these difficult questions through the lens of the learners' communities and build those communities back up again. There's been a huge impact on mental health from the shaming and public exposure of those living in poverty. And we need to address this through credibility, compassion, creativity, coherence, and community. Empathy is one thing that you can build, but maybe that's not enough, because empathy becomes an overemphasis on feeling rather than doing. And we need to develop active compassion. I'll pass you over to Kate now.
Sandra, so I'm just going to touch upon the other two of the four capacities, confident individuals and responsible citizens. And I feel maybe, oops, that's okay. I feel maybe I should make a bit of an apology for inflicting this picture on you once again, but we do think that it sums something up in relation to what we say. So let's think a bit again about the idea of a confident individual. Let's think about the things we've talked about identity, about self, about the idea of cognitive harmony, about the idea of austerity ailments, and flag up again something we'll be touching upon in our next module, the idea of cultural capital. And we thought this picture in particular sort of encapsulated that. Just reminding ourselves of who in our society, in our schools, is going to find it easier to be confident. Who writes the story that decides what matters and what doesn't, the things that give you confidence? Who matters and who doesn't? Who writes that story? And as somebody once using a term that somebody once used, who are the PLU? And I had to ask what that meant, so obviously wasn't one. And it means people like us. So who, for the people who define these things, are the people like us? And who are the non-PLU? Holding that thought and then moving on to looking at the idea of responsible citizens, let's look at some hidden issues here, and particularly if we look at it from a human rights narrative and a human rights-based approach, which is what we're doing. There are huge issues, not difficult to think about really, about citizenship narratives, because what about the people who aren't citizens? And if we compare the idea of citizenship with the idea of human rights, if we compare those narratives, one, citizenship is conditional. The human rights narrative is based upon unconditionality, that we don't have to do anything to earn those rights, but have them just by virtue of being a human being. The citizenship narrative, by its very definition, is exclusive because it confers this additional status on people who are then excluded if they are non-citizens, versus the human rights narrative of being inclusive of all human beings. And particularly the idea of responsibility seems to be tied in with the idea of citizenship as something that you have to earn, whereas human rights are just rights that are unconditional, that are not dependent upon certain kinds of responsibility, and we'll talk a wee bit more again in that in a minute. So before we do, let's just look again at the importance of reframing, reclaiming, or changing the narrative in poverty, which is what we're trying to do. So we want to help you as PACT participants to think about creating a shared overarching narrative in poverty. So let's start by looking at some of the existing narratives. So people don't believe poverty exists today in this country. I think there are some people who have had their eyes open for the latest crisis, but there are still many people who are in denial about the situation. And sometimes that's because they're blaming the individuals for being in poverty and saying that people should try harder and work more. And we've returned to this again and again. People who even who don't accept that narrative and who do care about it sometimes think there's not a point. There'll always be poverty and nothing is going to change. So returning to this idea of a shared overarching narrative in poverty, we want to look at one again that doesn't conflict between school and home, as we've touched upon before, that situates teacher and learner within the same narrative so that it isn't a them and us narrative, that has the potential to unify and enhance all our educational frameworks, as we talked particularly about in our last module, and we'll touch upon again in our next module. And as we've talked about before, in terms of human rights, education and poverty, we think this actually ticks all these boxes. So let's actually, just before we move on from here, think about the groups that these kind of narratives fall into. So really we're talking about denial and blame and acceptance, three overarching themes. And of course, there should be a fourth, the invisible one that's shared by many in the profession and many of you here today, I'm sure, one of anger, outrage, sadness and worry. And we know that many in the profession share these attitudes and feelings because they tell us so. So through our human rights-based approach to poverty, as I've just said, we want to help you to add another theme here, one of empowerment and of joint endeavour in that shared narrative, of being able to stand side by side together with our learners in solidarity through the power of human rights education on poverty. And just as we did for poverty in our previous modules looking at these narratives where we unpicked them, let's briefly unpick some of the common media and other narratives around human rights next. We've gathered 7 for now. Let's just read them out. So we all have human rights in this country. Human rights are unrealistic or idealistic. Human rights get abused by chancellors. What about my human rights? Human rights are a bourgeois construction. And human rights begin at home. And rights go with responsibilities, harkening back to what we just said a moment ago. If we actually look at them, they tend to fall into the same kind of 3 broad categories. So denial of human rights violations, of the validity of human rights, of the universality of human rights. blame. Blaming around not accepting the concept, not accepting the validity of human rights, and acceptance of violations and of conditionality. So let's just briefly look at each one here. So we all have human rights in this country. Well, we only have to revisit the poverty stats, the reality of that, and compare it with the rights, the human rights that are enshrined in international law and various treaties, but particularly the covenant that we just referred to. So I'll refer your thoughts back to the quote that we saw at the beginning. That covenant, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, also states that people have a right to an adequate standard of living, the right to social security, the right to just and favourable conditions of work, the right to take part in the cultural life of your country, as well as others, including the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Human rights are unrealistic and idealistic. Well, people might say we don't have a magic wand to literally do away with poverty overnight. There is a debate to be had there, but the covenant calls for the progressive realisation of economic, social and cultural rights, the continual progressive realisation of those rights. So there is always progress to be made, and there are many things that can do until that right is fully realised. And one of the things that we're not supposed to do is to take retrograde steps without prior justification and with the minimum steps that are possible, and to using the maximum available resources. So we'll just leave that for a moment and contrast that with the reality once again. Human rights get abused by chancers. Well, people who use these kind of views are usually talking about something like perhaps prisoners' rights. They quite often point the finger of blame at immigrants, as we know, and at conditions around people being deported or not being deported as they think should happen. So one of the really important things about human rights is that they're not just for your pals. And for people who hold views about certain groups of people, obviously views that we would all challenge, but nevertheless, the principle of human rights is that it is unconditional, that they belong to everybody. What about my human rights? Well, that's the point. It's about your human rights, and it's about everybody else's human rights, we would say to the people that say this. Sometimes accommodation has to be made between conflicting rights claims, for example, parental and children's rights. And often people who say, what about my human rights? When you actually tease that out, they're not really talking about human rights at all, but other categories of rights, because not every right is a human right. Or quite often they're targeting their rightful anger at something that's happened towards the wrong culprits. Again, the finger of blame. And who points this finger of blame first? Again, cui bono, as we said in our last module, who benefits from directing that finger of blame away from themselves in terms of governments and states? Human rights are a bourgeois construction. Some of you may have heard this, some of you may not. That's there because it actually seems to be amongst some people who would see themselves on the left of the political spectrum that you would expect to embrace human rights. I have heard say this in my own research when I was working on this as an academic. I found, and looking at it, was often based on some quotes from Marx that, given when he was writing, couldn't have been included in later 20th century human rights instruments. In my reading, he was referring to so-called property rights because he was critical of human rights being a bourgeois construction. And these property rights are still used and abused. Later objections have been to the wording and assumptions underlying some of the instruments, where people have tried to say that they're actually constructed in a certain way that favours certain countries and certain cultures. And there are certain arguments to be made around that, but that's about challenging the wording, not the underlying concepts, I would argue. So, for example, the right to just and fair conditions of work suggests that an employment-based society. But we don't need to go into that here, because it can become in the human rights world how many angels dance in the head of a pin. Human rights begin at home. Indeed they do. There's a famous Eleanor Roosevelt quote, who was one of the prime pushers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we used in the last module. And she says, where do human rights begin? Close to home, in those small places, of which school is one of those quoted. And indeed, looking at it from another perspective, human rights do and should begin at home. Thinking about the domestic abuse within the home, which, as we know, is escalating even more, if that was possible during this time. Thinking about child abuse within the home, where we know that most instances of child abuse are committed by people that the child knows. And also thinking about the exploitation of women's labour within the home. So looking at the last one, rights go with responsibilities. Well, the unconditional nature of human rights means that they don't depend upon responsibilities. Human rights education is about recognising the humanity of us all and our right to live in community, to take a full part in its life, and in doing so nurtures a sense of responsibility towards each other as valuable human beings deserving of dignity and respect. But if not, if you don't buy into that, you're still entitled to your human rights. Think about that difference between this and citizenship rights. And I'm actually struck with, when we talk about the 4 capacities and we talk about responsible citizens, that the first of these is respect for others, of course, very important, and a commitment to participate responsibly in various aspects of life. And these are so important, but where is where does it say about the rights, what you as a right holder and the rights that you have just by virtue of being human that are not conditional on these things? So I'm not a fan of the use of the word citizenship in these settings, and I'm speaking personally. Obviously, there are other many share. Just before I move on from that, I worked in a research project a number of years ago, talking to a group of Congolese refugees who had come through the Gateway Protection Programme, who had settled in Motherwell. And many of them had not been able to apply for citizenship because of the huge cost of that. And you will know, many of you, what a barrier that is to achieving citizenship. So a human rights approach and a human rights dialogue encompasses people in that situation, as I say, is far more inclusive than exclusive. So on that, just before I sort of look a wee bit more about human rights education, just want to say again that human rights education in general is powerful for teachers as well as learners. It has the potential, we believe, to lessen that sense of powerlessness, of feeling that teachers feel about we have to do more, we have to do something. And many teachers have reported that to us, and some of you have experienced that yourself. I'm sure all of you at some point will have heard it at least. The evidence shows that human rights education has the potential to ripple out into increased self-esteem for learners and a stronger sense of identity and self-worth, with all that potentially means for mental health, as well as explicitly and implicitly encouraging the kind of civic engagement and activism that Sandra has talked so eloquently about, not only in schools, but more widely. So being aware for a young person, but also for teachers, but particularly for young people here, being aware of being a rights holder can help to build a more confident individual, going back to that capacity, and potentially a responsible citizen. So let's just briefly look at some human rights education studies, particularly some important studies in Scotland. So on this slide on the left here is the cover of a very interesting report called Building Blocks for Improving Human Rights Education within Initial Teacher Education in Scotland, written in 2015 by Alison Struthers, who's done a lot of work in this field and who's based at the Human Rights Centre at Warwick University. In that report, I'll just give you the recommendations of that here. So in that report, the first recommendation says, and I quote, "The inclusion of human rights education within ITE should be made compulsory, and this change should be reflected by amendment to the GTCS standards. Competence in HRE should be included as an express requirement of provisional registration with the GTCS and would fit naturally within the social justice element of learning for sustainability." This report was actually written after discussion and consultation with all the main providers of ITE in Scotland, and includes in it, it's worth reading, includes in it looking at what elements of human rights education are already included within their syllabus. The second recommendation is really one for government, which says, given the current structure of IT programmes within Scottish universities, the inclusion of human rights education should be facilitated through the development of a flexible and non-prescriptive web-based resource that is made available to Scottish ITE providers, so obviously to support them. So I'll just draw your attention briefly to Scottish studies. These links will be in your resource pack, so you'll be able to follow them up yourself. One is a review of human rights education in schools in Scotland by Elaine Watts, written in 2013 for BEMIS. And that's quoted in a more recent study by Stephen Daniels, who's himself a former teacher, in 2019, entitled HRE in Scotland, Challenges and Opportunities. Stephen says, with all of this in mind, obviously what his discussions before, what is striking about the research literature is that there appears to be a broad consensus amongst teachers in Scotland about the importance of teaching children about human rights. The most prevalent issue highlighted was the lack of knowledge and training in ITE and CPD. 62% of respondents cited that, leading to a lack of confidence in classroom teaching. The Elaine Watt study was from 2013, commented on here in 2019. Our own experience, research and feedback suggests that nothing on that has changed substantially, apart from obviously the very important incorporation of the rights of the child. But here this is talking about human rights generally, and obviously we're making the argument in particular about human rights in relation to poverty. The Cinderella human rights, as I tend to call them, for reasons which we'll go into another point. The Cinderella group of human rights are those desperately needed to be known about and always invited last to the fulfilment ball, if you like, which is rights and poverty, economic, social and cultural rights, as we call them. So as I say, we'll talk more about that in our next module. So the second side of this slide is a screenshot taken from one of the many human rights academic journals, and it's a snapshot of articles just from one issue on human rights education. So it's just to give you an overarching sense of this rapidly growing field. And that includes a great deal of global international studies. We've gathered together some references for you from Finland, from the United States, from Australia, from India, from many countries, many of them talking about the empowering and transformational nature of human rights education. However, a wee note of caution is that very often, in a wider sense, when the human rights are talked about, as I said, economic, social and cultural rights are sometimes added as an afterthought, or actually sometimes even not mentioned at all. So one of the reasons why it's really useful to look at poverty through the lens of human rights is that obviously this is, for all the reasons that we've talked about, this is a huge gap that needs redressed, and we would argue would be a really good place to start thinking about the Convention of the Rights of the Child and beyond by looking at poverty-related rights. We'll give you a link to a critique from the magazine Radical Teacher that makes that very point, and it's an article that's actually worth reading. So we just thought perhaps we could have a little bit of a discussion on this here, if you're happy to do so, and perhaps sharing with the group again, either individually or personally or in chat. And we want to think about just a few prompts here about narrative in your school and workplace, and what you think are the dominant narratives, if any, in your school, or if you're not from a school, in your workplace. And thinking more about that, what effect do these dominant narratives have on poverty-related attitudes, school planning, actions, whole school actions, and perhaps also on the school's young people and their parents? So we're really just teasing these out as prompts, but we'd really like to hear your views on this. One of the narratives that has been shared with us is about the dynamics that go on within sort of power narratives in schools. I think that some people have been concerned about the idea of the disproportionate use of power, or perhaps some groups having more power than other groups, and how that obviously gets in the way for trying to achieve many of the things that we're all trying to achieve in terms of social justice. Just wondered if there are any more thoughts on that.
I think when you look at Bella Houston Academy, and then we heard that one of the deputies speaking, was it last week we heard him speaking?
We had him at the launch film, Claire.
Oh right, so that's probably where I heard him. But I think that makes a huge difference to how you can move things forward. And I just got the feeling from hearing that gentleman speak from Bella Houston, I thought I would love to be working with him, because he's saying the kind of things that I want to hear. So I think that's a huge factor anyway in schools.
Okay, well thank you for your comments, and I'm sure that Murdo would be delighted for your complimentary comments as well. So thank you very much. I would think that what you're saying may resonate obviously with some of our colleagues. Does anyone else would like to contribute anything more? Thank you, Claire. I think we've got maybe another couple of comments in the chat. From Judith, in my school, poverty is high on the agenda, othering is not. Well, delighted to hear that, Judith. From Lisa, in my college campus, there's a mix of students from moneyed families and those from families of high SIMD areas. There's pressure on a lot of them to have the latest fashion, as there's no uniform and money for lunch. Yes, thank you. That must be a particular issue for young people at college. Thanks, Lisa.
I work in a school with within Decile 1, and what we're finding just now is that our community, we had a really good sense of community before the COVID sort of happened, and we are finding that our parents are really struggling with not having the sense of the togetherness they have with the school. We had lots of initiatives that we were employing to include all of our kids. We're trying to be very inclusive in our school, and a lot of our parents are really, really struggling just now because they aren't able to come into the school. They don't have the clubs that we'd started up, and we're beginning to see almost a disintegration of the things that we built up, and it's really, really disheartening and very, very alarming to see, especially with some of the comments and things that we've been getting. We've got Seesaw up and running, and we're trying to reach out to people that need it, but we're beginning to see a drop off in that as well, and it's heartbreaking. I just thought I'd share that with people, and I wonder if anyone else is experiencing things like that.
Thank you, Karen. That is indeed a very scary word, disintegrating, and it does sound very, very worrying. Does anyone want to pick up on Karen's point there?
Claire, do you want to come back in on that one?
Yeah, because one of the things that my school's always been really good at is having clubs. So none of the clubs obviously are running, and I think, you know, there's lots of things staff pick up on in clubs to do with the, you know, difficulties that pupils are experiencing. So even though the school I work in has got SMID from top to bottom, you know, it's a huge range. But I think, you know, the only way people are finding out about difficulties is when things come to a head, you know, and it's really bad, instead of people finding out through the different mechanisms that sort of exist within a school. So I think within my school that's happening, that's definitely happening as well, because the only sort of way that they can find out is through guidance, or if there's some crisis. And at the moment, because of COVID, children aren't actually allowed to go and drop in to see the guidance teacher. They have to make an appointment, and you have to have access to Google Classroom to send an email, and you have to have data and da-da-da-da-da. So I think I would have thought that's happening in all schools. It is quite scary. I would agree.
Okay, well, really appreciate yourself and Karen and others voicing these thoughts, because it's something that isn't given a lot of attention, I think, in terms of more public pronouncements, and I think it's really, really important, so thank you for that. Before we move on, I'll just check, we have a comment in chat here from Nicola. The PEF money I feel is often not directed properly. I've seen in a couple of schools some pupils who are, for example, taken out of class for extra support. They don't actually need it, but they have been identified as SIMD 1 or 2. So they have been labelled and have been treated as that label. The head teachers often feel a pressure to provide data about the SIMD 1 and 2 children as we direct support to these kids. The children who actually need it, despite their SIMD label, may miss out. That's important, and of course it's worth repeating that, as we know, the majority of young people who are living in poverty are not living in the lowest SIMD areas. So that's really interesting and important. And from Judith, as a parent, the means of communication have narrowed to crisis only. Well, yes, that's kind of summing up what we've just been hearing. Yeah? The casual low-threat interaction is almost non-existent and really difficult to manage, even as a teacher parent. No. Thank you so much for that. And please do continue to give us your comments in chat or send them to us later. I'll just pass on to Sandra now for her next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks everyone for your comments. So let's start thinking now about what can we do? How can we take this knowledge and translate it into action? If we're thinking, you know, if we're developing these opinions, these strategies, this research evidence, how do we arrive at praxis? How do we turn that into action? So just highlighting a recommended reading here for you. I think when we were in this session on Wednesday, somebody bought this, or maybe the other book that I'm about to show you during the session. I really would recommend this. So let's have a look at critical pedagogy. And the Giroux text that I just showed you there is really, you know, it's now critical pedagogy in dark times, and I'd encourage you to look up the lecture on YouTube if you're not feeling up to reading an entire book about it at the moment. And so it's talking here about how with a neoliberal ideology, the market becomes the template for organising the rest of the society. And of course, we're seeing this in education. And much of Giroux's work has roots in Freire. You may be familiar with this text already, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And this is another recommendation for you. And so Freire points out that the role of democratic education has been devalued in favour of a pedagogy of commodification and repression. And at the same time, education's been refigured ideologically and structurally. And so now the educational force of the wider culture is where a lot of public pedagogy takes place. And we've seen a bit of that earlier in the session. And so when Giroux's talking about public pedagogy, he's talking about the modes of education that are largely produced and mediated and circulated anywhere but school, really. So we're talking about new media, old broadcast media, films, newspapers, TV, so many things. And ideologically, the knowledge and values and the social relations demonstrated in all of these realms of public pedagogy are really driven by imperatives of privatization and consumerism and commodification. And we as teachers need to do something about that. So Freire and Giroux both see teachers as public intellectuals. And we think, you know, there's another responsibility on the already overburdened shoulders of teachers. And you know, for me, I see this role as something I would really, really want to embrace, but I need a system there to support me. If we're going to become teacher activists, we need a system behind us. We can start, though, in the classroom. So what does this approach mean in the classroom? You know, the easy answer, just give everyone an iPad. Well, Giroux would say here that, you know, the technocratic agenda also removes the classroom from the larger social, political and economic forces. And it can offer something that's actually anti-intellectual. And it can give, you know, it can propose technical solutions to school and classroom problems. But there is another way. How about enabling learners to understand hidden messages through a critical lens, challenging the power relations implicit in texts, and encouraging students to interrogate societal issues and to critique the structures that are seen as the norms. So this is critical literacy. This is how we challenge the dominant narrative in the classroom. You may already be familiar with this text here from Janks in 2010. So Hilary Janks is deconstructing and reframing the, you know, there are some models of literacy that assume the embeddedness of critical literacy. So one of these we're going to look at just now is Luke and Free Bodies model. So this is the 4 resources model. So when we first learn our home language, we are text decoders, you know, where the reader's interested in how texts are built, the sounds, the letters, the words, the phrases. It's very much code breaking and meaning making from text. Then we become text participants. And when you're a text participant, the reader makes meanings from the codes of the texts. So you start to interpret the text using your own prior knowledge and accessing the intended meanings of the texts that the author was trying to convey. Next, we become text users, and we start to consider the social functions of texts that we're analysing, thinking about things like audience, purpose, form, structures, genres. And that helps us decide whether a text is convincing or not. Then we become text analysts, and we call this the critical turn, and this is where we want to get our readers to. This is where the reader becomes interested in how the text itself relates to issues of power, access, diversity, and social impacts. And here the reader can start to ask questions about who is included or excluded, and whose interests are served by the text, and how might this text be used to reproduce or challenge certain social norms. So, in terms of what's happening in our classrooms, you may have seen the final report of the Commission on Fake News and the Teaching of Critical Literacy in Schools. And I'll let you have a look over these statistics here, these very worrying statistics, just for a moment or two. And I mean, it's horrifying really that, you know, only 2% of children have these literacy skills to tell if a news story is real or fake. And that's something we need to do as teachers. I did actually do a bit of critical literacy work on the report itself though. And, you know, it began as an all-party parliamentary group of the Westminster government, a National Literacy Trust working in partnership. And then they involved Facebook. So, you know, the irony of that isn't lost on me there. And, you know, we can see the harm that this lack of critical literacy is doing to our children, to their well-being, to their mental health, by increasing anxiety and damaging their self-esteem and skewing their worldview. So we had planned here to send you off to a breakout room, but we've all engaged so much in discussion and so on that we're running short of time. So I propose, if you're happy with this, that we can just have a discussion here together, just in the larger group, about what are your experiences of critical pedagogy and critical literacy in your classroom. Maybe this is all new to you, so you might just want to think of some things that you might like to do. So rather than go to the breakout rooms this time, we'll stay together and just discuss these issues. So is there anyone who would like to come in and start here? We know, you see, that it's just the worst thing ever to let things overrun, especially on a Friday afternoon.
And I have done for a long time. I use picture books with children of all ages in primary school, but I would use them with adults as well. I have used them with student teachers, and to get the children to see what the author is trying to do. But I used books about diversity. So there's a lovely one called Susan Laughs, where you only see the child that uses the wheelchair on the last page. It's a picture book you could use with a P1 class. But I get them to start to think about those things and see why the author didn't show you till the end and to talk about Susan. But the last bit of it is to then use a metaphor, which I find really helpful, which is mirrors and windows. Which part of this book is a mirror for me of my life, and which part of this book is a window into something else, somebody else. And to recognize, the children begin to recognize that for some people, the use of the wheelchair in this case is a window into someone else's life, but for some people it's a mirror of their own life, and that there is structural. So even with a P1 or 2 or 3, you can teach them that it's not fair. For instance, there's another book called An Angel Just Like Me, where a boy can't find an angel for the top of his Christmas tree that's black. So children can learn that aspects of their identity, that they have lots of aspects of their identity, and I teach about that in a different way, but that some of those are not represented So poverty could be like, why is it that the children always live in a place with a garden, or these kind of things. So I have good experience of using picture books that have a positive intent as the starting place, and then moving on from there.
Yeah, and then we can look probably with older students, you know.
What they love looking at is really good because it's small enough. Like if you use a novel, it's too big. If you use what's the point of this and who's it aimed at and what's the message and all these kind of things. So,
and then when we start to look at the darker intents of things like
things that are missing.
Benefit Street.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Thank you, Judith. Would anyone else like to come in? I know everyone's running out of steam now because it's almost 3:30 on a Friday, so no pressure at all. But we do want to include everyone who wants to comment.
Yeah. The idea of comprehension and things like that, it needs to go right back a step to outside books before you even start, probably.
We're actually discussing that, well, the children have been given iPads this week in my class, and they're using them a lot for researching topics.
Yes.
Maybe that's a good way to begin to discuss critical literacy online, and not believing everything that they read from certain websites.
Yeah, I think, to look at, you know, what is this source for and what are the assumptions underlying it and so on. That's definitely a good place to start.
Heather also said something really interesting about Donald Trump and how and how he speaks a lot of things that are maybe, inverted commas, fake news or not true, and the children should think critically about that, and maybe not always believe someone in a position of power. Even though he is in such a position of power, they should still be taught to think critically about that.
Yeah, even more so.
Yeah, and analyse evidence and things like that.
Brilliant, yeah.
I mentioned The Social Dilemma, which is a film on Netflix about how, you know, Facebook and Instagram and everyone manipulates us into a particular worldview. And it was interesting, they were talking about how you shouldn't be using Google as a search engine. There's lots of kind of more ethical search engines that don't use sponsorship, and they won't feed you top results based on who pays the most and everything. So that's quite interesting. But my friends actually, I'll see if I can find them. My friends actually sent me a couple of good search engines that were better than using Google in terms of that. I'll see if I can.
I haven't seen that. I must watch that.
It's on Netflix. It's really good. And it's also appropriate for kind of like high school age kids as well, I would say.
Great. If you find it, maybe you could type it in the chat, Alina, so everybody can see it.
Hi, sorry, I was going to say we talked about the newspapers as well, the bias of the newspapers, politically biased as well, and not to believe everything you read in the newspaper, is, you know, because you often, if you could get a story politically that's out there and you get 6 newspapers and they've all got a different slant on it. So it depends who owns the newspaper and what their political view is and what the editor is saying as well. So it's, you know, so we're saying to the kids as well, be careful what you read and not believe everything you read. We've also talked about Wikipedia and watching what you see online, because you don't know who's actually posting that up there as well. So try and get good sources of information when you're doing your research, something that's been possibly peer reviewed and the likes, which all helps. So I think some kids do believe everything they read, and that's maybe not good either. So just a thought we had.
Yeah, and not just kids either, unfortunately.
No. Okay.
Can you go back a step, because not all children coming from poor households will ever have seen a newspaper in their house.
And then there's the other dimension that people, you know, might not even think that's an important source of news anyway.
I think if you go back to social media, because of the way social media works, you tend to get blogs and information that come up similar to what you're posting or like.
Yeah.
So you're getting that constant reinforcement of your views.
Yep. So that's what the film spends a lot of time.
But if you've got children who don't have reading materials and don't have papers in the house, then possibly many of them are not going to be predisposed to reading, and perhaps might not really be that interested in books as a whole. So you've got to start finding critical literacy outside of literacy.
So, oh yeah, from Nicola, yeah, I've been concerned about a couple of children this term who are telling me that COVID isn't real, and they say their parents see this as they see it on Facebook. Yep. And so of course sometimes parents need support to identify the resources and so on. And yeah, I'm really getting that cognitive dissonance from that situation, Nicola. Yeah, that's very, very difficult. And then I think in the secondary schools as well, that's you know, the sort of denial of COVID has been a really, really big issue. And then of course that's reduced the compliance with the safety measures. And you know, so it would be such an empowering thing for these young people to use these techniques to look at their sources. Thank you for that, Nicola. Am I seeing any other hands? I don't think so. Oh no, I am, Claire.
Because we're not, like in my school anyway, we're not actually allowed to gather. So it's really difficult to do the homework that you're asking us to do. So I don't know whether anybody else in the group has thought of maybe putting together a questionnaire for staff in terms of getting some feedback for this week and previous weeks.
You know, you're reading our mind here. We're just like about to share a slide about the homework and these, you know, these conditions and what we can do. So yeah, I think that's a great idea. But you mean for you to do like within your own school?
Yes, because I asked my head teacher today about because everything is so sensitive. You know, people are being overwhelmed by information, and I'm a bit concerned about giving teachers another email to read, or asking them to do something. And he said, well, he's happy if I put a questionnaire around, and then if there's interest that comes back, suggest to have well, we have to use Google Meet at school, that format, and you know, I'd be happy to do that, but I think it'd be more valuable if we put together the questions collectively in some way, you know, or and then you're going to get something back. At the moment, I'm not allowed to actually meet with people, and the only time I see people is for 10 minutes when we have a coffee break, and at lunchtime we're really discouraged to be grouping together. So I don't know, maybe somebody else in the group's got an idea about how to put that information together to get back from colleagues.
That's very interesting. Yeah. And do feel free to get in touch next week. Kate's away next week, but I'm here next week, and we can talk some more about what you might do in the school. Yes, I'm just going to reshare. If nobody else is waiting with a hand up, I'm just going to well, I've just seen the suggestion from Lisa here. Yeah, Microsoft Forms for collating views. That's not something I've ever used, but I'll definitely have a wee look. Great idea from Michelle there as well. I'm just going to reshare our final couple of slides here.
In our next module, that we will have a wider space, and we're encouraging you to bring things to share. We have called it Community Care and Share, taking it from one of our earlier references and one of our partners in Castlemilk, who have been operating that within their community, and we thought it would be lovely to operate that within our community here in PACT. So let's just share with you before we finish. Apologies for a couple of minutes, but it really will only take a minute or two. If you could bear with us, please. Obviously, if you have to go, we understand. So we just wanted to share with you some feedback from some of the workshops that we did, and some of the things that people were hoping to get from PACT, in which we've incorporated it and done our best to incorporate into our work with you. So from the learning reps, we had comments that said that they wanted to inspire hope for the possibility of change with this work, consideration of the sensitivities of teaching about poverty for the students who are living through it. Teaching agency, that word again is crucial, alongside understanding of our social, political and economic context. And there is the threat of poverty even when the parents are working, just a reminder of that, 0 hours contracts, etc. and teachers need to understand the implications of parental employment circumstances, and we'll include a wee bit more resources on that for the next one. And I can see that comment from Lisa popping up about great ideas to collaborate and share ideas. Yes, thank you, Lisa. We are trying and managing from your, we really appreciate your enthusiasm and your feedback to start to build a community that we want to be a sustainable community, to offer you peer support and making the kind of cultural changes you clearly want to make. So Sandra's going to just give you a wee bit last feedback here.
So we also did some work with the EIS head teacher and deputy head teacher network, and this is just a quick look at some of their feedback. So it can be difficult to identify the kids who have issues with poverty. We've talked about that a bit already, and especially because of this stigma. And one head saying everything in our attainment report is related to PEF. This is a really powerful one. Everything we do, we have to ask, how will it impact on our families? One school who had a home link worker, working in the home has been so valuable, builds trust and communication. And then this one, you know, tricky to find ways of proving the impact of the work. And that's something, you know, I find that further up the school, you know, and further up the local authority, there's a lot of this imperative to prove things. And that's, you know, that's something that, you know, it's hard to quantify, but actually, if we're looking at health and well-being outcomes, there's your proof if we do anti-poverty work. And of course, resource and staffing implications, which is a big consideration. So we've been so aware of the issues that Claire just mentioned, that this time, you know, we're really just hoping to make it as stress-free as possible with some reading and reflection. So we're thinking about the resource pack for Module 1, which is already available on the website. As Kate said, Module 2 is coming really, really soon. And also the wider reading that we've talked about today on critical pedagogy. And I'm just looking at Lisa's comment here about, you know, when participants are asking, like, how can we help make this better? That's, you know, this huge question is, you know, we are at the very beginning of this as a profession, really. And we can start to make these interventions in the practical financial interventions that were suggested in the cost of the school day toolkit, which we gave back in the special module, and they are all available in the resource pack and on the website as well. And also, in terms of the, you know, the more established frameworks like CFE, like GERFIC, in terms of personal well-being, we find that those can be really, really helpful. So all that remains now is to thank you all for your participation and engagement today. And it's a goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me. Thank you once again.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.